Deep within your psyche lies a primal force, the raw, unconscious drive for dominance that Freud recognized as fundamental to human nature. This isn't just about winning, it's about the profound psychological need to shape reality according to your will. You feel it in that surge of excitement when you gain an advantage, in the frustration when others control the game, in the constant search for leverage in every situation. Freud understood something crucial about power dynamics. They're rooted in our earliest experiences of helplessness. As infants, we discovered our ability to influence our environment through crying, smiling, or refusing. These primary experiences become the blueprint for how we later approach competition and control. The child who learned to manipulate through charm becomes the adult who instinctively knows how to shift social dynamics in their favor. Conventional approaches to gaining advantage often fail because they operate only at the conscious level. Strategies, tactics, visible moves. But the real game is played in the shadows of the unconscious mind. Your competitors aren't just fighting your visible moves. They're battling against their own hidden fears, desires, and compulsions. Understanding this transforms how you approach any competitive situation. The psyche plays a far more significant role in game changing than most realize. It's not just about outsmarting others. It's about understanding the psychological currents that drive behavior. When you grasp how fear of loss, desire for recognition, and need for control shape people's decisions, you can begin to shift the entire playing field rather than just making better moves within it. These deeper motivations, the unconscious drives that Freud mapped, hold the key to transforming any competitive situation. As we explore the unconscious battlefield where these games are really won and lost, you'll discover why understanding psychological dynamics gives you leverage that strategy alone never could. Section 1. The unconscious battlefield. Your competitive drive isn't just about winning, it's rooted in something far more primal. Freud recognized this as the death drive, thanatos, manifesting through the will to dominate. Every time you enter a competitive situation, you're not just engaging in a surface-level contest. You're acting out ancient psychological patterns formed in the earliest stages of development. This primal force shapes your approach to power, driving you to seek control, not just for practical advantage, but for deep psychological satisfaction. Think of how a simple board game can trigger intense emotional responses. That's your unconscious mind, treating it as a matter of psychological survival. They form their relationship with power in the crucible of early childhood. Watch children at play. You'll see the raw dynamics of dominance and submission, the first experiments with influence and control. Those who grew up with domineering parents might approach competition defensively, while those who learn to manipulate early become masters of indirect control. Your current competitive style wasn't chosen consciously. It was shaped by these early experiences of power dynamics. Each strategy you now employ carries the imprint of lessons learned before you could even speak. Competitive patterns crystallize through repeated experiences of success and failure. Your psyche, like a scientist conducting experiments, notes which strategies bring rewards and which lead to punishment. But here's the crucial insight. These patterns often form around avoiding pain rather than maximizing gain. The child who learned that direct confrontation brings punishment might develop elaborate indirect strategies, becoming the adult who changes games through subtle manipulation rather than open competition. These patterns become so ingrained that they feel like personality traits rather than learned behaviors. The ego serves as both warrior and diplomat in competitive situations. It protects you from the anxiety of potential loss, while negotiating between your primal drives and social requirements. Defense mechanisms spring into action automatically. Rationalization helps you justify aggressive moves. Projection makes competitors seem more threatening than they are, and sublimation channels raw competitive drive into socially acceptable forms. Understanding these mechanisms gives you unprecedented leverage. When you recognize that your competitor's aggression might be reaction formation against fear, you can shift the entire dynamic. Most people play by others' rules because challenging the game itself triggers primitive anxiety. Breaking established patterns feels dangerous to the unconscious mind. It represents a kind of psychological death and rebirth. This explains why even successful people often stay within conventional boundaries, fighting for advantage in games designed by others. Your unconscious mind prefers the familiar pain of losing at a known game to the uncertainty of creating new rules. This insight reveals why true game changers are rare. They've overcome not just external resistance but deep psychological barriers. Section 2. The mechanisms of power. Your greatest leverage lies not in what you do, but in your understanding of psychological dynamics. Think of the mind as a complex machine where pulling one lever can create cascading effects throughout the system. When you grasp how psychological leverage works, you can influence situations with minimal effort. This isn't manipulation. It's understanding how the psyche naturally responds to certain triggers. Like a skilled therapist who knows exactly which question will unlock a breakthrough, you learn to recognize psychological pressure points that can shift entire dynamics. They project their deepest fears and desires onto every competitive situation. This creates opportunities for profound leverage when you understand how projection and transference operate. Your competitor isn't just facing you, they're battling phantoms from their past, playing out old scripts written long ago. When someone reacts with disproportionate intensity to a minor challenge, they're revealing where their psychological weak spots lie. By understanding these projections, you can address the unconscious drama being played out, rather than just the surface conflict. Converting weakness into strength requires a fundamental shift in how you view psychological dynamics. What appears as vulnerability often contains hidden power. Your sensitivity to others' emotional states, your awareness of your own fears, even your perceived limitations, these can become advantages when properly understood. Think of how a martial artist uses an opponent's force against them. Similarly, psychological weakness, when consciously embraced, transforms into a form of strength that others can't defend against because they don't understand its source. The unconscious patterns in competition reveal themselves through repetition. Notice how people tend to fail in characteristic ways, succeed through familiar strategies, react to pressure with predictable responses. These aren't random behaviors, but expressions of deep psychological programming. Your ability to recognize these patterns gives you unprecedented advantage. While others react automatically to competitive triggers, you can operate from a place of conscious awareness, choosing responses rather than being driven by unconscious compulsions. Resistance, properly understood, becomes a powerful ally in changing games. When you encounter pushback, whether internal or external, treat it as information rather than obstacle. This resistance reveals where the psychological energy is concentrated, showing you exactly where to apply pressure to create change. Think of how a therapist uses a patient's resistance to guide treatment. Similarly, in competitive situations, the points of greatest resistance often indicate where the game is most vulnerable to fundamental change. Section 3. Mastering the inner game. Your shadow contains untapped power that most people spend their lives running from. Those competitive drives you've labeled as too aggressive, those manipulative instincts you've tried to suppress, even your capacity for strategic cruelty, these aren't flaws to be eliminated, but resources to be integrated. When you begin acknowledging these shadow aspects, something remarkable happens. Instead of these forces operating unconsciously, potentially sabotaging your efforts, they become conscious tools available for strategic use. This integration doesn't make you more aggressive, it makes you more complete. They remain trapped in unconscious patterns because transformation requires facing inner darkness. The competitor who only knows force remains limited by their one-dimensional approach. But when you understand your full psychological range, from ruthless strategist to empathetic collaborator, you gain the ability to shift between modes consciously. This flexibility comes from integration, not suppression. Your capacity to access different aspects of your psyche becomes a strategic advantage. While others remain predictable, locked in their habitual responses, you become adaptable, choosing your approach based on what the situation requires. Moving beyond ego-driven competition opens doors to unprecedented power. Most people compete to prove something, to themselves, to others, to the internalized voices of their past. This need for validation creates psychological blind spots that limit their effectiveness. When you compete from a place of integrated awareness rather than ego need, you see opportunities others miss. You're no longer fighting shadows from your past or trying to prove your worth. This psychological freedom allows you to focus purely on effectiveness rather than emotional satisfaction. Creating new rules requires a profound shift in how you relate to power itself. Instead of seeking power over others, you develop power with reality. This isn't just philosophical, it's intensely practical. When you stop fighting against the nature of situations and start working with psychological dynamics, you discover leverage points that others can't see. Think of how water shapes stone not through force, but through persistent, intelligent action. Similarly, your ability to read and work with psychological currents becomes more powerful than any direct application of force. The difference between authentic power and force lies in your relationship with resistance. Force meets resistance head-on, creating equal and opposite reaction. Authentic power, born from psychological integration, works more subtly. It's the difference between pushing against a door and finding its hidden latch.